Looking back, I don't know why I was so excited about that trip to the cabin. I mean, yeah, Paul and I needed a break, and the idea of spending a weekend in the mountains sounded perfect. But now, every time I think about that night, I get this sinking feeling in my stomach. I can't even drive at night without feeling on edge. It all started out fine. Paul and I packed up the car, throwing in a couple of duffel bags and the cooler with some snacks and drinks. We had rented this cabin through a website, and it looked really cozy and cute in the pictures. It was one of those places advertised as off the grid, which meant no cell service, no internet, just us and nature. Exactly what we thought we needed. We left pretty late, around 10 p.m., because Paul had to finish up some work, and I didn't mind. I actually kind of liked the idea of a night drive. Less traffic. And there was something about the dark that always made me feel like I was on an adventure. The GPS showed we'd be driving for about 2 hours, most of it on this long stretch of highway that cut through the woods. Paul was at the wheel, and I was the designated DJ. We had some music playing softly, and the road was completely empty. Just us, the darkness, and the occasional glow from the headlights reflecting off the signs. The first hour or so was uneventful. We chatted about the weekend, laughed about the stressful week we'd both had, and made plans for all the hiking we were going to do. But as we got further away from civilization, something shifted. The woods seemed to close in around us, and the road got narrower, more winding. I started to notice how isolated we were. No other cars, no streetlights, just trees and darkness. And then, out of nowhere, there was a car behind us. It wasn't there before, I'm sure of it. 1 minute, the road was empty, and the next, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. It wasn't just behind us. It was really close, like, right on our tail. Paul noticed it too. "Where the hell did that guy come from?" he muttered. He tried to keep his voice casual, but I could tell he was annoyed. I turned around to get a look, but all I could see were headlights. It was impossible to make out the car's color, or even the driver. I suggested pulling over to let them pass, but Paul said no. "There's no shoulder here," he pointed out, and he was right. The road was narrow, with dense woods on either side. The car behind us started flashing its high beams, blinding us for a moment. Paul cursed under his breath and sped up, but so did the car behind us. I could feel my heart beating faster. What was their problem? Why were they in such a hurry? There was plenty of room to overtake us, but they just stayed behind, riding our bumper. We came up on a sign for a rest stop, and Paul decided to pull in. I think we both just needed a break, a second to catch our breath and let the car pass. We pulled into the lot, and the car behind us sped past, disappearing down the highway. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "What a jerk," Paul said, shaking his head. We didn't see any other cars in the lot, so we figured we were alone. Paul went to use the bathroom, and I decided to stretch my legs. I wandered over to a vending machine to get a bottle of water. It was so quiet, just the rustle of the trees and the hum of the machine. For a moment, I felt silly for being so freaked out. It was just some impatient driver after all. We had let them pass, and everything was fine. Paul came back, and we got back in the car. I was feeling better, more relaxed. We pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, heading towards the cabin. The road was empty again, just like before. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes for a second, trying to enjoy the ride. But then, I saw them again. The headlights. The same car, I swear. It was behind us again, this time even closer than before. My stomach tightened, and I felt my hands get clammy. "Paul, it's them," I said, my voice shaking. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his jaw clenched. "What the hell?" he muttered. "How did they—" I didn't have an answer. They must have turned around and followed us from the rest stop. But why? Paul tried speeding up again, but no matter what, the car stayed right behind us. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. It felt like we were being hunted. We finally saw the turnoff for the cabin. Paul took it sharply, and the car behind us did too. We sped down the narrow dirt road, bouncing over potholes, and I just kept praying we'd make it to the cabin. Paul pulled up in front of the cabin and slammed on the brakes. He jumped out of the car, ready to confront whoever was behind us. But when we turned around, the car was gone. Just gone. Like it had never been there. I looked around, expecting to see taillights or hear an engine. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the trees. Paul stood there for a moment, confused. "Where the hell did they go?" he asked. But I had no answer. I was about to say something when I heard it. A noise from inside our car, like a rustling. I turned to look at Paul, but before I could say anything, I heard him scream. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. I spun around and saw him backing away from the car, his face pale. Then I saw why. There was a man crouched in our back seat. He was disheveled, with wild eyes that looked right through me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Paul grabbed my arm and pulled me away, and we ran towards the cabin, not looking back. I don't know how he got in or how long he had been there. Maybe he slipped in when we stopped at the rest stop, maybe even before that. But he had been with us the whole time. We managed to get inside the cabin and lock the door. Paul called the police, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anything. Just our car, with the back seat door open and a note left on the dashboard that read, "I see you." I don't think I'll ever forget that night. We never did find out who the man was or why he was following us. But now, whenever I get into a car, I check the back seat. Every single time.
Story 2.
I've always loved road trips. There's just something about the open road, you know? The feeling of freedom, like anything could happen. After my breakup, I figured a cross-country drive would be the perfect way to clear my head. No plans, no timeline, just me and my car. I packed up my stuff, grabbed a bunch of snacks, and hit the road. I thought a long drive might help me sort through all the crap in my mind, maybe even make me forget about all the things that were stressing me out. For the most part, it was working. I'd been on the road for days, just cruising through small towns, stopping whenever I felt like it, sleeping in motels, or sometimes just in my car under the stars. By late afternoon, I was on this stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. It was one of those roads where you can drive for hours and not see another car. Just desert and more desert, with the occasional cactus or tumbleweed blowing across the asphalt. The sun was setting, casting these long, eerie shadows that stretched out across the road. It was beautiful, in a lonely sort of way. That's when it happened. My car started making this weird noise, a sort of clunking sound, like something was loose under the hood. I'd never heard anything like it before. I pulled over, thinking maybe it was nothing. But as soon as I stopped, the engine died. Just like that. I turned the key, but nothing happened. It wouldn't start. I tried again, but the engine just made this clicking sound. I felt this tight knot of panic in my stomach. I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell reception, and the sun was going down. I got out and popped the hood, even though I don't know anything about cars. I just stared at the engine, hoping maybe there'd be an obvious problem I could fix. But of course there wasn't. I started pacing up and down the road, kicking at the dirt. There were no other cars around, no signs of life, just miles and miles of empty desert. I tried my phone again, but there was still no signal. I was completely cut off. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I felt this rush of relief. Finally, someone who could help. I waved my arms as the vehicle got closer, hoping they'd see me. It was an old, beat-up pickup truck, the kind you see in movies about the middle of nowhere. The truck slowed down and pulled over, and this guy got out. He looked to be in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He had this friendly smile, like he was just happy to see another person. "Car trouble?" he asked, walking over. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just died on me. I can't get it to start." He nodded, looking under the hood. "Happens a lot out here. Heat messes with the engine. I can take a look if you want." I was relieved. "Sure, thanks. I'd appreciate it." He fiddled around under the hood for a bit, poking at wires and hoses. I tried to make small talk, just to pass the time. "You from around here?" He glanced up at me, still smiling. "Yeah, I live about an hour back that way. Not much out here except desert and more desert. Where you headed?" "To the coast," I said. "Just passing through." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes I didn't like. A sort of curiosity that felt too personal. He was studying me, taking me in. I felt this flicker of unease. I reminded myself he was just being friendly, trying to help. Nothing to worry about. After a few minutes, he closed the hood and wiped his hands on a rag. "Looks like your alternator's shot. I can give you a lift to the nearest town if you want. There's a garage there. They can tow your car and fix it up." I hesitated. The idea of getting in a stranger's truck didn't sit right with me. But what choice did I have? It wasn't like I was going to walk to town. I glanced at my car, feeling torn. "Thanks," I said finally. "But I think I'll wait a little longer. Maybe someone else will come by. I don't want to leave my car here." He looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to say no. "Are you sure? It's getting dark. Not safe to be out here alone." I felt my heart speed up. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "Yeah, I'll be okay," I said, trying to sound confident. "I'll just wait." The man shrugged, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Suit yourself," he said. He headed back to his truck, and I watched him climb in. The engine roared to life, and he started to pull away. But as he did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the inside of the passenger window, was a handprint. A dirty, smeared handprint, like someone had been pressing against the glass. It was small, too small to be his. I felt this rush of panic. Had there been someone else in the truck? Someone hiding? I hadn't seen anyone else, but the handprint was there, clear as day. The truck drove off, disappearing down the road, and I was left standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I glanced around, suddenly paranoid, expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the desert and the fading light. I climbed back into my car, locking the doors, and tried my phone again. Still no signal. I spent the next hour sitting there, staring at the road, jumping at every sound. I don't know if the guy had really meant me harm or if I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Eventually, another car did come by, and the driver was an elderly couple. They seemed nice, concerned when they saw me, and offered to call for help when they got to town. I told them what happened, about the man in the pickup truck and the handprint. They exchanged a look, and the woman said, "You did the right thing, staying in your car. You can't trust everyone out here." I nodded, feeling a little better. They promised to send help, and I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the night. I never saw the man in the pickup truck again, and when the tow truck finally arrived, I was more than ready to get out of there. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten in that truck. Who did that handprint belong to? Had the man done this before? I guess I'll never know. But ever since that day, I've been a lot more cautious about who I trust, especially when I'm alone in the middle of nowhere.
Story 3.
I have to admit, I've never been a big fan of staying in one place for too long. Maybe that's why I got into photography in the first place. There's something freeing about capturing the world around you, like you're in control of what people see and don't see. So when I got my big freelance break to photograph scenic landscapes for a travel magazine, I packed up my car and hit the road. No plans, just me, my camera, and the open country. It was late summer, and I found myself in this beautiful rural area. You know the kind. Winding roads, dense forests lining each side, with the occasional rundown farmhouse dotting the landscape. The sun was setting, casting this warm, golden glow over everything. The kind of light that makes you feel like everything is right with the world. I pulled over onto a narrow gravel shoulder to capture the scene. The way the light filtered through the trees and danced on the leaves was magical. I spent hours there, just me and my camera, taking shot after shot. Before I knew it, the sun had almost dipped below the horizon and the sky was getting darker. I packed up my gear and got into my car, ready to head to the nearest town. I wasn't exactly sure how far it was, but I had enough gas to get there, so I wasn't worried. I turned the key in the ignition, and nothing. Not even a click. I tried again, but my car just sat there like a giant, useless metal box. I'll be honest, I don't know much about cars, but I knew enough to realize that I was in trouble. No cell service, no other cars in sight, and I hadn't seen a house for miles. I sat there for a minute, debating my options. It was getting colder, and I didn't exactly relish the idea of spending the night in my car. I tried the ignition one more time out of sheer desperation, but it was no use. Just as I was about to panic, I saw a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. A pickup truck was coming down the road toward me, moving slowly. I felt this strange mix of relief and anxiety. I mean, out here, who wouldn't be nervous about a stranger? But I was also desperate, and that desperation won out over my fear. The truck pulled over, and this guy got out. He looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a worn baseball cap and work clothes covered in dirt and grease. He had a friendly enough smile, and he seemed harmless. He introduced himself as Dave and asked if I needed help. I could feel my heart rate slow down a bit. He didn't seem threatening, just like some guy who'd been working on his farm all day. I told him my car wouldn't start and asked if he had a phone I could use. Dave shook his head and said he didn't have any service out here either. He offered to take a look at my car, though, to see if he could figure out what was wrong. Part of me wanted to say no, just because of the weirdness of the whole situation. But what choice did I have? So, I popped the hood, and Dave fiddled around with the engine for a bit. After a few minutes, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his pocket. "Looks like your battery's dead," he said. "I've got some jumper cables in the truck. Let me grab them." I nodded, feeling a wave of relief. At least it was something fixable. Dave headed back to his truck, and I watched him walk away. It's weird to explain, but something about the way he moved was unsettling. Maybe it was just my nerves, but he took his time getting the cables, like he was in no hurry at all. Finally, he came back, and we got the car jumped. I thanked him, feeling genuinely grateful, and told him I'd head to the nearest town to get the battery checked. But before I could even get back into my car, Dave stood there, looking at me with this odd expression. It wasn't threatening, just off. "You know," he said slowly, "it's not safe for a young woman like you to be out here alone. You should probably follow me back to my place. I've got a spare room, and I can take you into town in the morning." I felt my stomach drop. There was something in his voice that didn't sit right with me. I forced a smile and said I'd be fine, that I'd make it to town on my own. Dave's expression didn't change, but he nodded and walked back to his truck. I got in my car, heart pounding, and watched him in my rearview mirror. He just sat there for a moment, staring at me through his rearview mirror. Then he started the engine, gave me one last look, and drove off. I sat there for a good 5 minutes after he left, trying to calm myself down. It was fine. I was being paranoid. I started the car again, relieved to hear the engine hum to life. I pulled out onto the road and drove, keeping an eye on my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights behind me again. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out before me. I found a small clearing on the side of the road, a few miles down, and pulled over. I needed a break to collect my thoughts. I locked the doors, feeling a little safer with the barrier of the car around me. I leaned my head back against the seat, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease. I decided to stay there for a bit, maybe even doze off before continuing to the next town. I figured I'd just close my eyes for a few minutes. An hour later, I was jolted awake by the sound of a roaring engine. My heart began to pound as I looked up and saw the same pickup truck approaching. The headlights flooded my car, blinding me for a moment. Dave pulled up next to my car and got out, holding a flashlight. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him approach. "Hey!" he called out, his voice carrying over the stillness of the night. "You really shouldn't be out here all alone. It's not safe." His tone was different now. Less friendly, more commanding. He shined the flashlight through my window, and I saw his hand resting on the handle, his knuckles white. For a moment, I thought he was going to try to get into my car, and I felt a surge of panic. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm fine, really," I said. "I just need to rest for a bit. I'll be on my way soon." Dave stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," he said, but his voice had a hard edge to it. "But I'll be keeping an eye out for you. It's not safe here, not at all." He turned and walked back to his truck, giving me one last look before climbing in. The truck roared to life, and he drove off, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, shaking, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally started my car and pulled back onto the road. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from there. As I drove, the only sound was the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. Eventually, I reached a small town and found a diner that was still open. I went inside, ordered a coffee, and called the local police. I told them everything, from the dead battery to Dave's offer and the way he'd come back. They were concerned, said they'd send a car to check the area and keep an eye out for his truck. They found tire tracks on the main road, but no sign of Dave's truck. They told me to be careful in the future about accepting help from strangers and reassured me that they'd keep an eye out. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in the lot of a well-lit motel. I didn't sleep much, just kept thinking about Dave's face, the way he looked at me. I'm more careful now. I always make sure I have a full tank of gas, a fully charged phone, and a backup battery. And I never, ever stop for long on those lonely country roads. The world is a beautiful place, but sometimes it's the most beautiful places that can hide the darkest secrets.
Story 4.
I've always loved solo road trips. There's just something about the open road that clears my mind, like hitting a reset button. I'd been feeling a bit burned out from work lately, so I decided to take a trip from Chicago to the Grand Canyon. I planned everything, packed my gear, checked the route, made sure my car was in top shape. You know, all the responsible things. I've never been one to take unnecessary risks. I mean, I'm a tech consultant, not some thrill seeker. I like my comfort, but I also like my space. The trip was going smoothly, just me and the endless miles of road stretching ahead. The feeling of freedom was incredible. I'd been driving through this remote area for a couple of hours, somewhere in New Mexico, I think. It was one of those places where civilization feels like a distant memory. You know the kind. Long stretches of nothing but desert and the occasional tumbleweed blowing across the road. I was about 30 miles past a small town when I felt my car starting to act up. The engine sputtered a bit, and then the warning lights on the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. My heart sank. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it was just a glitch. But the engine died completely when I tried to restart it. Great. Just great. Here I was, miles from the nearest town, and my car had decided to quit on me. I got out, popped the hood, and stared at the engine like I actually knew what I was looking at. I'm not exactly a car guy, but I thought maybe I'd see something obvious. Of course I didn't. I took out my phone to call for roadside assistance, but there was no signal, no bars. I knew this was a possibility in such a remote area, but it still sucked when it actually happened. That's when I saw the pickup truck. It was an old, beat-up thing coming down the road towards me. As it got closer, I felt a mix of relief and caution. I mean, I was stuck out here, and any help was better than no help, right? But you never know with strangers. The truck pulled over, and a guy in his mid-50s got out. He was wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. Kind of looked like your average middle-aged farmer. Friendly enough, or so I thought. "Hey there!" he called out, giving me a wave. "Car trouble?" "Yeah," I replied. "It just died on me. No signal on my phone either." He nodded like he'd expected that. "Not a lot of coverage out here. I'm Carl, by the way." "Sam," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, the kind of handshake that's supposed to reassure you. "Thanks for stopping. Do you think you could help me out?" Carl glanced under the hood of my car, not really looking at anything in particular. "Well, I'm no mechanic, but I could give you a lift to the next town. There's a garage there. Probably just needs a tow." Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. There was this slight edge to his voice, almost like he'd been waiting for this. But I brushed it off. I mean, what was the alternative? Stay here all night and hope someone else came along? "Thanks," I said, "but I think I'll wait with my car. Maybe someone else will pass by." Carl raised an eyebrow. "Suit yourself, but you could be waiting a long time. Not a lot of traffic on this road. You sure you don't want to come with me?" I noticed then that he kept glancing back at his truck. I couldn't see much from where I was standing, just a toolbox, and what looked like some coiled rope in the bed. My gut told me something was off. I didn't like the idea of leaving my car. But more than that, I didn't like the idea of being alone in a vehicle with this guy. "I'm sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks, though. I'll wait it out." Carl's face changed. It was subtle, but his friendly expression slipped for just a second. There was this flash of irritation in his eyes, and his smile became a little too tight. "Suit yourself," he said again. "But it's not safe to be alone out here. You never know who you might run into." I swallowed hard. Was that a warning? A threat? I couldn't tell. I just knew I didn't want to leave my car. I thanked him again, trying to keep my voice steady. Carl nodded, but I could tell he wasn't happy. He stood there for a moment, as if deciding what to do next, then turned and walked back to his truck. He got in, but didn't drive away. For a few seconds, he just sat there, looking at me through his rearview mirror. I felt my stomach tighten. What was he doing? Was he thinking about forcing me to go with him? I had my keys in my hand, ready to jump back into my car and lock the doors, even though I knew that wouldn't do much if he really wanted to get in. Finally, Carl started his truck, gave me one last look, and drove off. I stood there, watching until his truck disappeared down the road. The relief I felt was almost overwhelming. But then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were no brake lights. He hadn't gone far. He must have just pulled off the road a bit further down. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was he waiting for me to drop my guard? Planning to come back and catch me by surprise? I got back into my car, locked the doors, and tried to think. Should I stay put and hope he didn't come back? Or should I start walking, try to put some distance between us? I didn't like either option. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the adrenaline making my hands shake. An hour passed, maybe more. The sun was setting, and the sky had gone from orange to a deep purple. I was starting to relax, just a little, convincing myself that maybe Carl had really driven off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. And then I heard it. The low growl of an engine in the distance. My heart jumped into my throat. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the outline of Carl's pickup truck. He was coming back. I fumbled for my phone, knowing it wouldn't work, but needing to do something. I tried starting my car again, but of course, it was dead. I was trapped. The truck got closer, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness. I could see Carl behind the wheel, his face expressionless. He pulled up next to my car and got out, holding a flashlight. The beam cut through the window, blinding me for a second. Carl's voice was calm. Too calm. "You really shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "It's dangerous. You need to come with me." He moved closer, the flashlight in one hand, the other resting on something in his pocket. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to find out. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away. Just as Carl reached for my car door handle, I heard the sound of another vehicle approaching. Headlights lit up the road, and a large SUV came into view. Carl hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. He stepped back from my car and turned to his truck, cursing under his breath. The SUV slowed down, and a man rolled down the window, looking between me and Carl. "Everything all right here?" he asked. Carl forced a smile, backing away toward his truck. "Just checking on this guy," he said, "making sure he's okay." The SUV driver looked at me, and I nodded, trying to communicate my fear without saying anything. He seemed to get the message. "Why don't you stick around for a bit?" the driver said to Carl. "Just until we get things sorted." Carl's smile dropped. He glanced at me one last time before getting back into his truck. "Whatever you say," he muttered. He started the engine, gave me a final, chilling look, and then drove off, his tires kicking up dust as he sped down the road. I explained the whole thing to the driver, who stayed with me until a tow truck finally arrived. We called the police, but there was no sign of Carl's truck when they checked the area. They found tire tracks on the main road, but nothing else. They took my statement and assured me they'd keep an eye out for Carl. As I sat in the back of the police car, I couldn't shake the feeling that Carl wasn't gone for good. Maybe he was just biding his time, waiting for another chance. The police warned me to be careful, to think twice before accepting help from strangers, especially in isolated places. I haven't been on a solo road trip since. The freedom I used to love now feels like a trap. I still think about Carl sometimes, wondering what he was planning, what would have happened if that SUV hadn't shown up. And I wonder if he's still out there, driving those lonely roads, looking for someone else to help.
Story 5.
I'll never forget that stretch of highway. It's one of those places that sticks in your mind for all the wrong reasons. You know, the kind of memory that makes your stomach knot and your hands grip the steering wheel a little tighter. For me, it's that stretch of road in the southwest, nothing but desert for miles. The sky was turning that brilliant orange as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. This place, it's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's also empty. Too empty. There's something unnerving about being so isolated. But then again, that's why I came out here, to get away from everything. I'm a photographer, and I love capturing the raw, untamed beauty of nature. These trips usually recharge me, help me clear my head. Usually. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had my gear packed, a cooler full of snacks and drinks, and my car was running like a dream. The weather was perfect, just the right amount of cloud cover to make the desert look less harsh. I'd been driving for hours already, just me and my music, no destination in mind, just following wherever the road took me. I was about 30 miles past the last town where I'd fueled up. The map said there wasn't another town for at least 50 miles, but that's never bothered me. I'm prepared, always have been. You have to be when you're out here alone. As the sun dipped lower, I started to think about finding a place to pull over for the night. I wasn't in any hurry, but the last thing I wanted was to get stuck driving in the dark out here. It was then, out of nowhere, that I spotted him. A figure on the side of the road, standing still as a statue. A man, just standing there facing the highway, with no car in sight. I felt my heart jump into my throat. I hadn't seen another car or person for miles, and there's this guy just standing there, like he's waiting for something, or someone. Instinctively, I locked my doors. My pulse was quickening, but I told myself to stay calm. There could be 100 reasons why he's out here. Maybe his car broke down and he was just waiting for help. Still, my mind flashed back to 5 years ago. It was on a trip like this, in a place not so different from here. I had picked up a hitchhiker, a guy named Adam. He seemed friendly at first, thanked me for stopping. He said his car had broken down and he needed a lift to the nearest town. I had always been careful, always told myself I wouldn't do something so stupid as picking up a stranger. But there was something in his voice. He seemed harmless. For a while, everything was fine. We made small talk, and he asked about my photography. But then he got weird. He started asking about money, saying he was in trouble and needed a lot of cash fast. When I said I didn't have any, his demeanor changed. He got aggressive, shouting at me, demanding I give him what I had. I remember his hand disappearing into his jacket and coming out with a knife. Panic took over, and I did the only thing I could think of. I swerved the car sharply, sending him off balance. Before he could react, I hit the brakes, reached over, and pushed him out the door. He hit the ground hard, and I drove off, leaving him in the dust. I never reported it. I just wanted to forget. But you don't really forget something like that. It stays with you. So there I was, staring at this guy standing alone on the side of the road, every muscle in my body tense. As I got closer, I slowed down, just a little. I didn't want to, but something in me felt compelled. I needed to see his face. His clothes were dirty, dusty like he'd been out there a while. His hair was matted, and his eyes, they were empty, like he was looking right through me. I shivered and pressed on the gas. As I passed him, he didn't move, didn't raise a hand, didn't even blink, just stood there, staring. I kept driving, trying to push the image out of my mind, but it wouldn't go. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after me, but he was just standing there, getting smaller and smaller until he disappeared from view. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Get a grip, Jess," I muttered to myself, trying to laugh it off. I cranked up the music, hoping it would drown out the lingering unease. About 10 minutes later, I saw headlights in the distance, coming up fast behind me. I checked my speed, thinking maybe it was a cop, but I wasn't speeding. As the car got closer, I realized it wasn't a cop. It was an old pickup, beat up and rusty, the kind you see in horror movies. It was coming up too fast, weaving slightly, like the driver was in a hurry or maybe drunk. My stomach tightened. There was no reason to panic, I told myself. People speed all the time. But as the truck got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the same truck I'd seen 5 years ago, the one Adam had described. My hands tightened on the wheel. The truck was almost on top of me now, its headlights glaring in my mirror, blinding me. Then, just as it seemed like it was going to hit me, it swerved into the other lane, pulling up alongside my car. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I glanced over, just for a second, and my blood ran cold. The driver was the man from the side of the road. His eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled, a slow, crooked smile that made my skin crawl. I hit the gas, my car lurching forward, trying to get away from him, but the truck kept pace. He honked his horn, the sound blaring through the empty desert, and then he pulled in front of me, cutting me off. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. I was breathing hard, my heart thundering in my chest. He got out of the truck and started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. My mind was racing. I could try to reverse, but his truck was blocking the road. I could try to go around him, but the ground was uneven, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck. He was getting closer, and I could see the knife in his hand. It was the same knife, the one Adam had used. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. As it rang, the man stopped, his head tilting to the side, listening. I realized with a jolt of terror that there was no service out here. He knew it too. He started laughing, a low, menacing sound that made my blood turn to ice. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the car into reverse and floored it. The tires spun for a second before catching, and I shot backward, turning the wheel sharply. The car swung around, and I hit the gas again, speeding away from him. I heard a shout behind me, angry and guttural, but I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I just drove, my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, parking right in front of the door, and ran inside. The attendant looked up, startled, as I burst in. I was shaking, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. He called the police, but when they arrived, there was no sign of the man or the truck. They took my statement, looked around, but there was nothing. Just empty desert. They told me I must have imagined it, that maybe the long drive was getting to me, but I know what I saw. I know he was real. I haven't been able to get back on the road since. Every time I see a pickup truck, I feel that same rush of fear, that same chill. I keep telling myself it's over, that he's gone, but deep down, I know he's still out there, waiting.
Story 6.
You know, I've been on the road for work more times than I can count. After a while, you get a knack for finding the best shortcuts, the routes that help you avoid traffic, and the quickest way to get from point A to point B. I've driven through back roads, sketchy neighborhoods, and desolate highways. None of it really bothers me. I pride myself on knowing my way around and being able to handle myself if things ever get weird. But this one time, man. This one time I bit off more than I could chew. It was just a typical Tuesday morning. I had a meeting set up in this small town about 5 hours from my place. I'd done the trip before, but this time I decided to try out a new shortcut I'd heard about from a colleague. "Cut your drive by an hour," he'd said. I punched the route into my GPS and hit the road. Everything was fine for the first few hours. The sun was shining, traffic was light, and my playlist was on point. Then, as I got deeper into the countryside, the landscape started to change. The highways turned into narrow, winding roads, with nothing but farmland and the occasional cluster of trees. I didn't mind. It was nice to be away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But then, about 50 miles out from my destination, I realized I was low on gas. I hadn't seen a station for ages, and my fuel light was blinking. I kept driving, hoping I'd come across a place soon. Finally, just as my car started to sputter, I saw a gas station up ahead. It was one of those old, run-down places that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The paint was peeling, the sign was faded, and the only light came from a flickering neon open sign. I didn't have much choice, so I pulled in. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it. That uneasy feeling you get when something isn't quite right. There was no one around, not even at the pump, which seemed strange. I walked up to the door, and a bell jingled as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was just as run down as the outside. The shelves were half empty, and there was dust on everything. Behind the counter stood a guy who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sunken, and his face was lined with dirt. I gave him a nod, trying to act casual. "Hey, how's it going?" I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty store. He didn't respond, just stared at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but shrugged it off. I'd dealt with rude people before. No big deal. "Can you point me in the direction of the nearest town?" I asked, trying again. Still nothing. The guy just kept staring at me. I glanced around, noticing for the first time that there were cameras in every corner of the store, all pointed towards the door. Something about the setup felt off, like they weren't there for security but for surveillance. I turned back to the guy, my patience starting to wear thin. "Look, I just need directions. I'm trying to get to Madison," I said, naming the town where my meeting was. He finally spoke, his voice low and gruff. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This isn't a place for outsiders." I laughed nervously, not sure if he was joking or not. "Well, I'm just passing through. No harm in that, right?" He shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't have come here. They don't like strangers." At that moment, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. I turned to look through the dirty windows and saw a group of men gathering near my car. They were all wearing the same kind of old, faded work clothes, and they all looked rough around the edges. One of them, a tall guy with a thick beard, pointed at me and then back at the car. My heart rate picked up. "What's going on?" I asked the clerk, my voice rising a bit. "They think you're a spy," he said quietly. "They don't take kindly to people poking around where they don't belong." I felt my stomach drop. "A spy? I'm just a sales guy trying to get to a meeting," I said, more to myself than to him. This couldn't be happening. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I glanced at my phone, but of course there was no signal out here. No way to call for help. The men outside started moving towards the door. I could hear them talking, their voices muffled but angry. I turned back to the clerk. "Is there a back way out of here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He just shook his head. "Number. If you want to leave, you'll have to talk to them." The door swung open, and the men walked in, filling the small space with their presence. The bearded guy stepped forward, glaring at me. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. I held up my hands, trying to show I meant no harm. "Look, I'm just passing through. I needed gas, that's all. I'm not looking for trouble." He snorted. "That's what they all say. You got a camera in that car? A microphone? Who sent you?" I blinked, taken aback. "No, I don't have anything like that." I'm not a spy. I'm just a salesman. I sell office supplies, for God's sake." The men exchanged glances. One of them, a shorter guy with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "Empty your pockets," he said. "What?" "Empty your pockets," he repeated. "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind." I hesitated, but I didn't have much of a choice. Slowly, I reached into my pockets and pulled out my wallet, keys, and phone, laying them on the counter. The bearded guy picked up my phone and looked at it, turning it over in his hands. "Password," he demanded. I swallowed hard. "I'm not giving you my password." He raised an eyebrow. "Then you've got something to hide." He nodded to the other men, and they moved closer, surrounding me. My heart was pounding now. This was bad. Really bad. "I don't have anything to hide," I said quickly. "I just don't want to give you access to my personal information. I'm not a spy." I swear the bearded guy stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Take him outside," he said. Before I could react, two of the men grabbed my arms, dragging me toward the door. I struggled, but they were too strong. They pushed me out into the open air, the sun blinding me for a moment. They dragged me around the side of the building, out of sight from the road. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out of this. There were more men now, a dozen at least, all watching me with hard eyes. The bearded guy stepped forward again. "We've had problems with spies before," he said. "People poking around, asking questions, trying to find out about us." "I don't care about you," I blurted out. "I don't even know who you are. I'm just trying to get to Madison. Please, let me go." He shook his head. "We can't let you go until we're sure you're not a threat. We're going to search your car." I felt a surge of panic. "You can't do that. That's my car, my property." He ignored me, nodding to two of the men who started toward the car. I was desperate now. I had to do something. But what? Then I remembered my phone. It was still in the bearded guy's hand. I'd set it up with an emergency call feature. If I pressed the side button 5 times quickly, it would call 911, even without a signal. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Wait," I said, holding up a hand. Okay, you can have the password. Just don't hurt me." He smirked, holding the phone out. "Go on then." I reached for it, and as I did, I pressed the side button 5 times in quick succession. The phone vibrated slightly, and I saw the screen flash emergency SOS before he pulled it away. "What did you do?" he snapped. "Nothing," I said quickly. Just trying to show you the password screen." He glared at me, then looked at the phone, frowning. I held my breath, praying that the call had gone through. One of the other men came over, saying something in a low voice, and the bearded guy nodded. They turned their backs on me, talking amongst themselves. I could see them glancing at me, suspicion in their eyes. I took the opportunity. Slowly, I started to back away, inching towards my car. My heart was racing, every muscle tense. They were distracted, but it wouldn't last. I had to move fast. I turned and ran for it, sprinting toward the car. I could hear shouts behind me, but I didn't stop. I reached the car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine row roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, backing up as fast as I could. The men were running towards me now, shouting, but I didn't care. I hit the brakes, shifted into drive, and floored it. The tires squealed as I shot forward, the men diving out of the way. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I drove for miles, not slowing down until I was sure I'd put enough distance between me and that gas station. My hands were still shaking, and my heart was pounding, but I was alive. I was safe. I glanced at my phone, still clutched in my hand. There was a missed call from 911. They'd tried to call me back, but I'd been too busy running for my life to notice. I pulled over to the side of the road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I called 911, explaining everything as best I could. They said they'd send someone out to check on the gas station, but it would take a while. It was a remote area, and they didn't have many officers nearby. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I got back on the road, driving as fast as I dared. It wasn't until I reached the town of Madison, hours later, that I finally started to feel safe again. I checked into a motel, locked the door behind me, and collapsed on the bed, my heart still racing. I never did find out who those men were or what they were so afraid of. The police called me a few days later, saying they hadn't found anything suspicious at the gas station. Just an old clerk who claimed he hadn't seen anything unusual. They ested I might have imagined the whole thing. Maybe a side effect of stress or fatigue. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know one thing for sure. I'm never taking a shortcut again.
Story 7.
You ever had one of those nights where everything just feels off, like the universe is nudging you and saying, "Hey, something's not right here"? That's pretty much how I felt that night. I'm Paul, a long-haul trucker. Been doing this for years, and I love the quiet of night driving. There's something peaceful about the hum of the engine and the empty stretches of highway. But that night, well, it wasn't peaceful at all. So, I was hauling a load through this pretty desolate part of the country. You know, one of those stretches where the only signs of life are the occasional roadside crosses and a few lonely tumbleweeds. The kind of place where cell service is more myth than reality. My fuel gauge started dipping dangerously close to E, and I knew I had to find a gas station soon. After what felt like forever, I spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. It looked like an old-school gas station, probably from the 70s or something, with one of those peeling, faded signs that said gas and snacks. It was the only light in miles, so I figured, what the hell, I might as well fill up and maybe grab a coffee. I pulled in, and the place was even more run down up close. The windows were dusty, and the whole building looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades. No one was around, which wasn't too surprising given the hour. There was an old payphone near the entrance, and I remember thinking how odd it was to see one in this day and age. I got out and started pumping gas, the nozzle squeaking as it filled up my tank. That's when I started hearing these weird noises. It was like a low hum at first, but then I could have sworn I heard whispering. I looked around, thinking maybe it was just the wind or the rustling of the leaves, but there weren't any trees nearby, just an old fence and some dried up bushes. After I topped off the tank, I headed inside to pay. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a little bell jingled. The inside was just as bad as the outside. Dusty shelves with expired snacks, a few half-empty drink coolers, and a counter with a cash register that looked like it belonged in a museum. There was still no one around, so I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. I glanced at the back of the store, where there was a door with a restroom sign. Figured I'd use it before getting back on the road. As I walked over, I got this really uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. But there wasn't a soul in sight. I pushed open the restroom door, and that's when things got weird. The light flickered on, casting this dim, yellow glow. The place was surprisingly clean, but as I looked around, I noticed something odd. There was a tiny red dot on the ceiling, right above the sink. At first, I thought it was just a defect in the light, but then I realized it was a camera lens. A freaking hidden camera in the restroom. My skin started to crawl. I quickly left the restroom, and as I walked out, I noticed there were more of those little red dots all over the place. Behind the shelves, near the entrance, even above the payphone outside. It felt like the whole place was rigged with surveillance. I decided it was time to get the hell out of there. I went to the counter, pulled out some cash, and left it there, hoping that covered the gas. Just as I was about to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around and saw a group of people standing in the doorway. They were a mix of ages, but they all had this unsettling blank expression on their faces, like they were dead inside. One of them, an older guy with greasy hair and a stained shirt, stepped forward. "You're not supposed to see that," he said, his voice low and cold. I tried to play it cool, saying something like, "Just looking to pay for my gas." But they didn't move. They just stared at me, blocking the only exit. My heart was racing. I thought about trying to push past them, but there were too many. And who knew what they had behind the counter? One of them, a woman with wild hair and a twitchy eye, moved closer. She pointed to the restroom and said, "You shouldn't have gone in there." That's when I noticed a small door behind the counter. It was slightly ajar, and I could see stairs leading down. My mind started racing, thinking about all the horror stories I'd heard on the road. People disappearing, never to be seen again. I knew I had to get out of there fast. I took a step back, trying to think of a plan. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud crash from the back of the store. The group turned towards the noise, and I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted for the door, shoving past them with everything I had. One of them grabbed my arm, but I managed to break free and sprinted to my truck. I jumped in, locked the doors, and floored it. My tires screeched as I peeled out of there, gravel flying everywhere. As I sped down the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The group was standing outside the gas station, just staring after me. Not running, not yelling, just staring. I drove for miles before I finally pulled over at a rest area. My hands were shaking and I was drenched in sweat. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. Eventually, I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them everything. They took my report and said they'd check it out. A few days later, I followed up with the police. They told me they'd found the gas station, but it was abandoned. No people, no cameras, nothing. Just an old, empty building. They said it had been closed for years. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank, or maybe I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. But whatever it was, it scared the hell out of me. I haven't driven that route since, and I make sure to always fuel up at well-lit, busy stations, because you never know what's out there, waiting in the dark.
Story 8.
Enjoying the content? Subscribe now for more. I've been on the road for more years than I can count. Name's Sam, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out there, especially on those lonely stretches where it's just you, the truck, and the open road. But nothing quite prepared me for what happened one night while hauling a load through a mountain pass. It was one of those crisp, clear nights where the stars seemed closer, almost like you could reach out and touch them. I had a long haul ahead of me, and I was looking forward to the solitude. The roads were quiet, with just the occasional car passing by. It was just the way I liked it, peaceful, almost meditative. I was winding my way through the mountains, the engine humming steadily, when I noticed something odd in my mirrors. 3 black SUVs appeared behind me, seemingly out of nowhere. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe just a group of folks traveling together, enjoying a late-night drive. But then I noticed something strange. They didn't have any license plates, just plain black bumpers, and their headlights seemed almost too bright, like they were aftermarket or something. I kept an eye on them as I continued along the road. They stayed behind me, not too close, but definitely keeping pace. The mountain pass can be tricky, especially at night, with all its twists and turns. But these SUVs were handling it like pros. It started to feel a bit off. I mean, it's not unusual to see convoys, but something about these vehicles felt coordinated, deliberate. After a while, I realized they weren't just following me. They were matching my speed, my movements. I slowed down, they slowed down. I sped up, they did the same. It was like some kind of game, and I wasn't keen on being the main player. Then things got weirder. The lead SUV pulled up alongside me, just pacing me. I glanced over, trying to see who was driving, but the windows were tinted, practically blacked out. I couldn't make out a thing inside. It gave me the creeps, like I was being watched by faceless shadows. The other 2 SUVs flanked me, one behind and one on the other side. They were boxing me in, and that's when the panic started to set in. I tried not to let it show, but my hands were gripping the wheel tighter than they should have been. I slowed down again, hoping they might just pass and leave me be, but they didn't. Instead, they matched my speed, closing the gap just enough to make it clear they weren't going anywhere. I started thinking about all the stories I'd heard from other truckers. You hear about hijackings, people getting robbed on the road. But this felt different. It felt orchestrated. Like they had a plan and I was right in the middle of it. I decided I wasn't going to stick around to find out what that plan was. My heart was racing, but I kept my cool and started planning my escape. I remembered a turnout a few miles ahead, one of those narrow dirt roads leading off the main highway, often used by locals and hunters. It was risky, especially with a full load, but I figured it was my best shot. As we approached the turnout, I took a deep breath and made my move. I signaled like I was going to pull over, hoping they'd think I was complying. Just as I reached the turnout, I jerked the wheel hard, cutting onto the dirt road. The truck swerved, tires skidding on the loose gravel, but I managed to keep it under control. The SUVs reacted immediately. The one behind me tried to follow, but I guess they weren't expecting the sudden turn. They overshot the entrance, skidding on the gravel before correcting course. The others slowed down, but I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I floored it, the truck bouncing on the uneven road, dust kicking up behind me. I glanced in my mirrors, heart pounding in my chest. The SUVs were still there, struggling to keep up on the rough terrain. I pushed the truck harder, navigating the twists and turns as best as I could. After a few minutes, I noticed they were falling behind. The narrow, bumpy road wasn't ideal for their sleek vehicles. Eventually, the headlights disappeared from my mirrors, swallowed by the night. I kept driving for a while longer, just to be sure. When I finally felt safe enough to stop, I pulled over and killed the engine. My hands were shaking and I took a moment to catch my breath. The only sound was the cooling engine ticking and the distant chirping of crickets. I didn't stay there long. Once I calmed down a bit, I turned around and headed back to the main highway, keeping an eye out for any sign of the SUVs. They were gone, just as mysteriously as they'd appeared. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, thinking back on it gives me the chills. I shared the story with a few other truckers at a rest stop a few days later, and to my surprise, a couple of them had similar experiences. They'd seen the same convoy of black SUVs, no plates, all tinted windows, and they'd been tailed through the same mountain pass. Some even said they'd been chased or boxed in just like me. It became this weird sort of legend among us. A tale of the mysterious convoy that seemed to target truckers on lonely mountain roads. We speculated about who they might be: government spooks, some kind of secretive organization, or maybe even a criminal gang. But no one had any real answers, just a bunch of stories and a whole lot of questions. These days, I avoid that route if I can. And if I do have to take it, I make sure I'm well fueled and try to pass through during daylight hours. You never know what's out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It's a reminder that no matter how experienced you are, there's always something out there that can catch you off guard. And sometimes, it's not the road you need to worry about, but what's traveling alongside you.